Now we know that style rules are weighted, and the browser considers our styles, the author styles, to be more important than the default styles provided by the browser's default style sheet. We also learned that the order in which a rule appears is important. I showed you how the last rule wins. However, what we've learned so far still does not explain the sample I showed you at the beginning of this module. Given the three styles that we see on the screen, why would the div appear with a red background? You'd think that the background would be green or black because those rules appear later than the rule that says divs inside the body should have a red background. To answer this question, we have to understand specificity. It turns out that the browser gives each style rule a specificity rating, which is a way to quantify the importance of a rule. The higher the specificity number, the more important the rule is. You can think of the specificity number as consisting of three parts, A, B, and C. C is the count of type selectors in the rule. B is the count of class and attribute selectors that are in a rule. And A is the count of ID selectors. This all means that a rule using a wildcard selector would have a rating of 0. A rule using a selector of LI to select list items would have a rating of 1. That 1 is in the C position. And a rule using UL space LI to select list items in an unordered list, that would be more important because it would have a rank of 2. There are 2 type selectors in that rule. The li.red rule is selecting list items with a class attribute of red. And then the last selector here, the one with the highest ranking, is the one selecting an element with the ID of content. That puts a 1 in the A position. That means the rating is 100. Remember, rules that have a higher number here will win out over rules that target the same element but have a lower number. And before I give you a demonstration based on this concept, let's see why our div is red. It's because the wildcard selector in this code on the screen has no specificity rating. It will try to set everything to have a green background, but it's such a low priority rule it probably will not have much effect. It's literally not a very specific rule. The rule selecting divs and setting the background color to black is more specific and has a higher rating. However, the rule setting the div elements appearing underneath the body tag is even more specific and has a higher specificity rating, and thus it wins and sets the div's background to red. Of course, that div would have to be an immediate child of the body element and not just any descendant, because that's what that first selector rule is looking for. But let's look at some examples in a demo. To get a better idea about specificity, let's go into our simple web page and set some styles inside of styles.css. First, I'll go inside of here, and it's currently empty, and say that all paragraphs should have a background color of green. And if I save that, you can see that the background color on both of the paragraphs that are inside of the simple web page, they both turn green. However, now let's target this paragraph, which is a child element to this div. And if I write a rule that says, please set the background color of paragraphs that are inside of a div to something different, let's pick gray, then that rule will set this paragraph that is inside of a div to have a background color of gray, because this rule that has 2 type selectors in the rule is more specific than the rule that just says set all paragraph backgrounds to green. And I could even make a more specific rule that targets this paragraph by ID. So I could say when you see something that has an ID of content, then please set the background color to fuchsia. And it doesn't matter the order that these rules appear in, they are all different rules. This one is selecting paragraphs inside of a div, this one is just selecting paragraphs, and this rule is more important than that rule that is just selecting paragraphs. This rule that is selecting by ID is more important still. And if you think about it, this is the way that you want CSS to work. When you make a more specific rule, you're probably targeting very specific elements that are on your page. You want that rule to work against those specific elements. But when you're making a general rule, like this one that is setting the background color to green, that's not as specific. That's generally trying to set the background color to green, but there's always going to be exceptions if that paragraph has an ID of content or if that paragraph is inside of a div. Now there's one more catch to specificity that I should probably point out, and that is a rule that is embedded in a style attribute is the most specific. So if I come in here and I set the background color to black, that style rule is actually going to win out over any style rules that are inside of styles.css. So indeed that paragraph turns black. So let me take this inline style out once so that we can go back to seeing the actual text that's inside of here. And let me point out something else about these rules. When we talk about a rule winning, we're not saying that this rule completely replaces all of the settings that were in the lesser rules. In other words, if I come into the rule that is selecting all paragraph tags and say that the font size for all paragraphs should be 2em, which would make the font quite a bit larger, you can see that applies to both paragraphs, even the paragraph that is inside of a div, because there's no other rule, more important rule, that is trying to manipulate the font size. And indeed, if we come into the developer tools, if I hit F12, we can go to that particular paragraph tag that is inside of a div, and you can see here are the property values that were actually set on that paragraph and where they came from. We set the font size using a rule that was selecting all paragraphs. We also tried to set the background color, but that particular property setter was overwritten by a more important rule, the one that was trying to select paragraphs inside of a div and set the background color to gray, and that particular rule was also overwritten by a more important rule that was setting the background color to fuchsia for anything with an ID of content. The styles that appear in these developer tools for Internet Explorer will be ordered according to their specificity, and that is why the pound content appears at the bottom. But you can see that multiple different rules can still have an impact on our elements, even when they're not the most important rule that could apply to that element. This rule was the only one that was trying to set the font size, therefore that particular property set made it through. There is one more important aspect of CSS to understand if you're trying to come to grips with why a particular element appears in a certain fashion, and this aspect is inheritance. Some property values of an element will be inherited from the element's parent. I've already talked about such and such an element being a child or being inside of some other element, and this parent-child relationship goes back to the DOM, the Document Object Model, which, if we visualize a web page, would look very much like a tree. On our simple web page, we have a paragraph that is a child element of the body tag, and we also have a paragraph that is a child to a div tag. The div tag is the paragraph's parent because the p tag is nested inside of the div tag. There are certain properties that we could set on that parent div or on the parent body that will flow through and be inherited by all of the children underneath that element. One example is the font size property, and let me show you in a demo why this makes sense. To see inheritance at work, let's go into our web page and modify the styles for our web page to say that divs should have a font size of, and let's make it very small to make this noticeable, 8 pixels. I'll save that and refresh the page, and you'll notice that the text inside of this div is now 8 pixels, and the text that is inside of a paragraph that is inside of a div is also 8 pixels. And that's because the paragraph inherited this font size from its parent div. We can verify that by going into the developer tools in Internet Explorer or in Chrome. In Chrome, I'll hit F12, come down to this paragraph, and you can see inherited from div is a font size of 8 pixels. Now, of course, you can override inherited values. In this case, I can go and I can explicitly say that paragraphs should have a font size of 22 pixels. This will make this very noticeable. And you'll notice that the text inside of a div is 8 pixels, but the text inside of our paragraphs, even the ones that are inside of a div, is now 22 pixels. And in fact, you can see where font size of 8 pixels that is inherited from div, that now displays in a strike-through font, which means it was overridden by some other rule. In this case, the matched CSS rule that says paragraphs have a font size of 22 pixels. If you think about it, then again, this inheritance for font size makes sense. Imagine that inside of this div, we had some additional markup, like a word that was inside of a strong tag and a word that's inside of an emphasis. I'll add that to both the div and also here at the end of this paragraph, and save this and refresh. And you'll notice that those individual elements, emphasis and strong, inherited the font size settings of the parent container that they were inside of. And this is a good thing because this is probably the way that you want the text to display. Just because you're emphasizing a word doesn't mean that you want it to jump back and use some different font size. You want it to fit with the rest of the text that is inside of a div or inside of a paragraph. And I want to be able to do that without writing individual style rules that say, okay, the emphasis inside of a paragraph should be 22 pixels, but the emphasis inside of a div should be 8 pixels. Everything is just inherited and is just going to work for me. So let's look here and see that emphasis inherits a font size of 22 pixels from being inside of a paragraph. What will make this slightly confusing is that not every property value is inherited. Font size is an example of a property value that can be inherited from a parent, but a border is an example of something that cannot be or is not inherited from a parent by default. And over time, you'll learn what property values are inheritable and what property values are not, and typically, again, these settings make sense. So for example, let's save this style sheet and see that I now have a border around my 22 pixel font inside of a paragraph, but notice that the emphasis and the strong words did not inherit that border. What we don't want to do is draw a border inside of the border to have a border around this emphasis that's inside of the border that's part of the paragraph. That particular value is not inherited. What you'll find as you work more and more with CSS is that font-related properties are typically inheritable. So font size, font family, also list-related styles are inheritable. So things like list style type and list style, those will inherit. When it comes to margins and padding and border, those values typically do not get inherited by child elements. In this module, we learned about 3 important and core concepts to working with cascading style sheets. We saw how the cascade works to assign an importance to style rules coming from different sources, like the default browser style rules, the user style rules, and the author rules. We also learned how specificity assigns a weight to individual rules depending on how specific those rules are, and the rule with the highest specificity will always win when setting a particular property value. Finally, we looked at inheritance and how some property values, like font size, will flow down the document tree. That is, those values will be inherited by child elements and the children of those child elements all the way down unless they are overridden. All of the rules about how CSS works internally will typically make sense with how you want to work as a designer. Specific rules should override general rules, and property values should be inherited when they make sense and allow you to write fewer rules and less code.